special honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Rodrigo Roa Duterte, President of the Republic of the Philippines.
Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Head of the State and Government, Excellencies, I am honored to address you today on behalf of the Filipino people on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The invisible enemy that is COVID-19 has brought about an unfamiliar global landscape and unleashed a crisis without precedent. It is the biggest test the world and the United Nations face since World War II. While the United Nations has brought relief and hope to so many countries and peoples around the world, it now finds itself saddled by a virus that has taken many lives and wrecked economies and social order. We are at a crossroads. How we address COVID-19 will define our future. For the Philippines, this means putting up all of the peoples of our United Nations at the core of this response. We will need to ask hard and fundamental questions about the vision and mission that the United Nations conceptualized 75 years ago. We need to ask ourselves whether or not we have remained true and faithful to the United Nations principles and ideals. Mr. President, in the light of the realities of the present, the Philippines grieves with all of the families all over the world who lost their loved ones to this horrible virus. We extend our heartfelt condolences. We salute all frontliners who put up their lives on the line even in countries not their own. So also do we honor and recognize the healthcare professionals who selflessly answered the call and to combat the COVID-19 pandemic despite its virulence and unknown characteristics. While each nation has its own strategy in fighting the pandemic, what the world needs are coordinated international plans and efforts to pursue a common purpose. COVID-19 knows no border, it knows no nationality, it knows no race, it knows no gender, it knows no age, it knows no creed. The Philippines values the role that the United Nations plays in its fight against the pandemic. And a middle-income country whose economic advances have been derailed by the pandemic, we welcome the launch of the UN COVID Response and Recovery Fund. Ensuring universal access to anti-COVID-19 technologies and products is pivotal in the global pandemic recovery. The world is in the race to find safe and effective vaccine. When the world finds that vaccine, access to it must not be denied nor withheld. It should be made available to all rich and poor nations alike as a matter of policy. The Philippines joins our partners in the ASEAN and the non-aligned movement, and in raising our collective voice, the COVID-19 vaccine must be considered a global public good. Let us be clear on this. We can call for a global health agenda with enough resources and policy space for the World Health Organizations. We need a WHO that is quick to coordinate and quicker to respond. The Philippines will do its part in the pooling of global resources. Our health workers are among the best. Mr. President, just as we needed stability and confidence because of the pandemic, geopolitical tensions continue to rise. Escalating tensions benefit no one. The new flashpoints heighten fears and tend to tear peoples apart. When elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled flat. Given the size and military might of the contenders, we can only imagine and be aghast at the terrible toll on human life and property that shall be inflicted if the world war deteriorates into a real war of nuclear weapons and missiles. I therefore call on the stakeholders in the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, and Africa. If we cannot be friends as yet, then in God's name, let us not hate each other too much. I heard it once said, and I say it to myself, complete agreement. Mr. President, Filipino migrant workers have been devastated by the pandemic. Many have lost not only their livelihood, but also their health and lives as well. Yet they go on in the front lines, healing, caring others in the different parts of the world. The Philippine government has embarked on an unprecedented repatriation program. More than 345,000 overseas Filipino workers needed to come home then. We have brought back half and are bringing back the rest. We thank the countries that have provided Filipino migrants with residence permit, access to testing, treatment, and related health services in this pandemic. We brought back most of our seafarers who were stranded because of COVID-19 restrictions. We pioneered with the IMO of the Green Lane for a safe changes of seafaring crews. In these times, we need stronger cooperation in promoting and protecting the rights of migrants, regardless of their migrant status. We must all adhere to the Global Compact of safe, orderly, and regular migration. Unless states include all the migrants in this response to this pandemic, no one among us is safe until everyone is safe, as the Secretary General has said. With the poverty rate reduced at 16.6% and a sustained economic growth of 6.4%. Between 2010 and 2019, the Philippines was on track to becoming an upper middle income country by the end of 2020. But the pandemic has placed our economy in recession. Despite this downward pressure on growth, the Philippines remains committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. President, the same urgency needed to fight COVID-19 is needed to address the climate crisis. This is a global challenge that has worsened existing inequalities and vulnerabilities from within and between nations. Climate change has worsened, and the ravages of pandemic. People in the developing countries like the Philippines suffer the most. We cannot afford to suffer more. The Philippines joined the Paris Agreement to fight climate change. We call on all parties, especially those who have not made good their commitment to fight climate change, to honor the same. We call on all parties to strengthen communities and peoples for preparedness and resilience. We're talking about mankind and Earth, our one and only home. Mr. President, the Philippines will continue to protect the human rights of its people, especially from the scourge of illegal drugs, criminality, and terrorism. A number of interest groups have weaponized human rights, some well-meaning, others ill-intentioned. They attempt to discredit the functioning institutions and mechanisms of democratic country and a popularly elected government which in its last 2 years still enjoy the same widespread approval and support. These detractors pass themselves off as human rights advocates while preying on the most vulnerable humans, even using children as soldiers or human shields in encounters. Even schools are not spared from their malevolence and anti-government propaganda. They hide their misdeeds under the blanket of human rights, but the blood oozes through. To move forward, open dialogue and constructive engagement with the United Nations is the key, but this must be done in full respect of the principles of objectivity, non-interference, non-selectivity, and genuine dialogue. These are the fundamental basis for productive international cooperation on human rights. Mr. President, terrorism looms large. As I said at the Aqaba process, the Philippines will do everything and partner with anyone who would sincerely desire to protect the innocent from terrorism in all its manifestations. The Marawi siege, where foreign terrorist fighters took part, taught us that an effective legal framework is crucial. Our 2020 Anti-Terrorism Act shores up the legal framework by focusing on both terrorism and the usual reckless response to it. Its enactment was done pursuant to our commitment and the strict adherence to the relevant Security Council resolution and the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Most importantly, we remain committed to rebuild the stricken community and address the root causes of terrorism and violent extremism in my country. We must remain mindful of our obligation and commitment to the Charter of the United Nations, and as amplified by the 1982 Manila Declaration on the peaceful settlement of international disputes, the Philippines affirms that commitment in the South China Sea in accordance with UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award. The award is now part of international law, beyond compromise and beyond the reach of passing governments to dilute, diminish, or abandon. We firmly reject attempts to undermine it. We welcome the increasing number of states that have come in support of the award and what it stands for: the triumph of reason over rashness, of law over disorder, of amity over ambition. This, as it should, is the majesty of the law. Mr. President, the global health crisis has further complicated the global security environment. But no aspiration nor ambition can justify the use of weapons that destroy indiscriminately and completely. There is no excuse for deaths that a nuclear war could cause, nor the reckless use of chemicals and biological weapons that can cause mass destruction. These weapons of death put us all at mortal risk, especially if they fall into the hands of terrorists without a shred of humanity in their soul. We can call all member states to fully implement the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention. I have asked the Philippine Senate to ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and importantly, we were among those to sign it first. Mr. President, the Philippines has a long history of opening its doors to the refugees, from the White Russians following the 1917 revolution, and the European Jews in the Second World War, and the Vietnamese in the late 1960s, and the Iranians displaced by the 1979 revolution, among others. The Philippines continue to honor this humanitarian tradition in accordance with our obligation under the 1951 Convention of the Status of Refugees and the 1967 Protocol. But lest we forget, helping the most vulnerable, those displaced by conflict, persecution, and political instability is a shared responsibility of all countries. As I have said many times, the doors of the Philippines are open, as they have always been, to everyone fleeing for safety, such as the Rohingyas. In the face of mounting refugee crisis worldwide, let us work together towards ending the conflicts and conditions that force people to flee their homes. Mr. President, as our societies become more diverse yet interdependent, social cohesion issues come to the fore. Mutual understanding always accompanied by mutual tolerance between those of different faiths and cultures is the only foundation of societies at peace with itself and all others. Finally, I express gratitude to the gallant peacekeepers, including our own, who advance the cause of peace in the most difficult situations. From the Golan Heights in the Middle East to Liberia in West Africa, Filipino peacekeepers put themselves in the front line between the vulnerable and those who seek harm. We are committed to increasing Philippine footprint in UN peacekeeping operation with increased participation of women. Again, Mr. President, to defeat COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges, we must work with seamless unity, which demands complete mutual trust and the conviction that we will win or lose together. We cannot bring back the dead, but we can spare the living, and we can build back better, healthier, and more prosperous and just societies. To this end, we rededicate ourselves to the multilateralism. The UN remains humanity's essential organization, but it is only as effective as we make it. To make significant changes, we need to be bold. We need the same collective courage that finally made the United Nations a reality 75 years ago. We need to act on long-standing recommendations to improve the Security Council's composition and the working together and working methods, to strengthen the role of the General Assembly and to streamline the processes and the operation of the UN. Indeed, to be ready for the new global normal, it cannot be business as usual for the UN. Let us empower the UN, reform it to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. Let us strengthen it so it can fully deliver its mandate to maintain peace and security, uphold justice and human rights, and promote freedom and social progress for all. After all, we are the United Nations. Thank you.
So we're back. I think we really want to address, folks here representing Malaya movement, ICHRP, and the different alliances that, that we're partnered with. Want to respond to Duterte's address. I'm so glad to see that, he's finally, approached the United Nations, because only so long ago he was sort of, dismissing, him and his administration were dismissing, even their legitimacy, right? And so when we take a look at his speech, when we take a look at the words he said, it's really important to, hear the message that he's trying to, convey, that ultimately he was saying, talking about taking so many lives when he was referencing COVID-19 and that it wrecked economies. And I think we have to question who was it really that was, who was it really that has taken so many lives and wrecked the economies during this time of COVID? When, during the time that he was, waging his war on drugs, who has, taken so many lives? We know that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, even if the discrepancies between, the government and official statistics are massively different from what, the people's, accounts are. Even then, 8,000, 9,000 lives is way too many. And so, when we take a look, when he's saying things like, that this pandemic has taken lives and wrecked economies, we really have to, reflect that question back to him. And when he is giving this sort of fake reference to the principles of the UN, what happens then when, he militarizes the country, right? And enacts a law that he's talking about that has truly, he's saying shoring up the legal framework of this counterterrorism strategy. And we have to say, like, well, there's definitely going to be a shoring up, if anything, a shoring up of more bodies, that has already piled up, all across, the Philippines, because of his militarized, strategies to public health crises. It's scary to hear him talk about nuclear war, this more fear dealing and warmongering, and talks about the mortal risk of these threats of war and sovereignty, but really where's we've taken a moral risk, if anything, we've taken a moral risk in keeping him in presidency, and keeping him in power. If there's anything that we really, if anything, I agree with what he said, is that we need to be bold and we need to have collective courage. And I agree that he has been in power for way too long, that we do need to be bold and we need to have collective courage to really fight against this persisting martial law, this persistent dictatorship that he has, been enacting over the Philippines. And so, yeah, I think, for us in the Malaya movement, like, we just have to say, like, one, we have to, like, stop killing the activists and the human rights defenders who are truly holding on to the real principles of the UN. And that really these calls from the UN and from the people are to hold him accountable, him and the government accountable for their culture of impunity that has persisted. That there needs to be no more military aid. For us here in the Malaya movement in the U.S., we have a very specific role to unite as one Filipino people around the world, to cut off support to a fascist, to cut off support for someone who has persistently neglected the rights of the Filipino people. And so that, we really say, no more support for military aid to the Philippines and to Duterte regime until he is held accountable for mass murder. And so as we move forward, I think that those are the things that I really want to hold on to, that it is true. We need to be bold. We need to have collective courage to truly oust this president now. I want to say, bring us to our next speaker, I think, will be Drew from ICHRP.
Thanks, Malaya. Yeah, I'm Drew Elizarde Miller with the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. My main comment on Duterte's address is that it really overall is the presentation of a facade. And this is a facade in direct counter to the report from Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights High Commissioner. And in her report, she lays out all these different issues of human rights in the Philippines and the attacks on human rights defenders and land defenders and indigenous people that Malaya had alluded to. And so what Duterte puts out in this speech in calling for amity over ambition and putting out lines about non-proliferation is really a facade of peace that seeks to cover up the real war going on in the Philippines against human rights defenders, as well as pushing against the UN HRC recommendation under Michelle Bachelet for a human rights monitoring committee on the Philippines. The issue of the climate crisis is also another example of this. Under the Duterte administration, the Philippines has become known as the deadliest country for land defenders. Some people may know of the case of Brandon Lee, who is the Chinese-American activist from the Bay Area who was shot in front of his home for his solidarity with the Cordillera people. And as ICHRP-US, we also recently launched our campaign in coordination with the Cordillera people to defend Cordillera and land defenders in that area. And from that, we've learned clearly that the Duterte government continues to disregard the rights of indigenous people, and to privilege the rights of foreign corporations and bureaucrats over the rights of indigenous people, and also as a way to exploit the land for the benefit of the rich. And so with that, again, we see that Duterte is pandering to the Paris Accord, and climate crisis is really not consistent with his response that is in fact contributing to the climate crisis and the exploitation of indigenous people. And so lastly, we want to recognize on the question of non-interference that Duterte raised, that we see interference as U.S. military aid to the Philippines and foreign corporations pushing indigenous people off of their land. And so as ICHRP-US, as a solidarity organization, we express our solidarity with the Filipino people and not with the Filipino government. And the call and the push for human rights in the Philippines is an issue of people-to-people solidarity. Thank you. Next, I want to pass it off to Adrian from Anakbayan, USA, to share their thoughts on this matter.
Thanks, Drew, and thanks, Malaya. I'm really glad that Malaya reached out, and as well as the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Kabataan Alliance, to give comment on Duterte's first address to the United Nations. I couldn't agree more with what Malaya and Drew have said already. I think there's a lot of posturing going on here, especially given that there's been so much international attention and criticism against the Duterte regime for failed policies, anti-people policies, and a very militarist government, fascist government overall. I wanted to comment in particular around his claims on economic development, which are a real slap in the face to the people who are suffering from excruciating poverty in the Philippines. Duterte boasted that the Philippines was on track to becoming an upper middle income country, but then the pandemic happened. And so what can we take from this statement by Duterte is that he believes that the Philippine economy was on track to relieving poverty for a vast majority of people, so that if the international community views the Philippines as this upper middle income country, then that gives the assumption that a majority of the Filipino people have access to being upper middle income, when we know that's just definitely not the case, right? Earlier this year, Duterte went on a campaign. His administration went on a campaign to talk about what is his legacy in the past few years that he's been president, called this Duterte Legacy Campaign. There were numerous reports that went out about the different benefits of the economic policies, for example. And one of the greatest critiques that came from the Ibon Foundation, which really took, point by point, where the shortcomings of this false government propaganda, this disinformation that is saying that the economy has actually developed. And one of the clearest ways that we can see that the Filipino people are very far from being upper middle income as a whole is if we take a look at the agricultural sector, right? If we take a look at the peasant farmers who still continue to make up a majority of the Philippine population in the countryside, in the rural areas, in the provinces. The agricultural sector itself, there's been a crisis. There's slowing growth. It's becoming less a part of the gross domestic product of the country. There's rising import dependence, which is so ironic, right? When the Philippines continues to be such a grain basket, producing rice, producing other things for the rest of the world, so many of these farmers can't even feed their families, right? There's this rising import dependence because instead of putting the rice that they harvest on the table, they're having to buy from foreign countries. There's also, job loss, widespread rural poverty, especially among farmers and those who rely on the fishing industry. And so, not only in the agricultural sector are there impacts, in terms of in the urban areas, the train law, the tax reform law that Duterte signed in 2018 has had huge effects on the prices of basic commodities. It has even affected migrant workers, right, in terms of the value of the remittances that they're spending back home become less because the prices of basic goods are increasing. His Build program, this widespread infrastructure program that has only caused wasted taxpayer dollars, that has caused encroachment on indigenous lands for infrastructure projects, and of course the continued out migration of Filipinos because there is no economic opportunity for Filipinos in the country. And so, with the pandemic, Duterte was saying that the virus knows no age, no gender, et cetera, but his economic policies that were trying to lift the people up, or they didn't lift the people up. Those policies did have a bias because they were not meant to help the poor. They were not meant to help the working class. We still have a jeepney. The ban on travel really affected jeepney drivers. There's still an ongoing jeepney phase out. And that lockdown affected millions of poor families. And those poor families weren't just created because of the pandemic. They were there long before. So there are all these systemic structural problems in the country's agriculture, in the country's industry, that really set up the stage for millions upon millions of people to be suffering under this pandemic. And even more so under Duterte's militarized response to the pandemic versus giving livelihood response or a true health response to take care of the people. And so we are going to continue to remain critical of the Duterte administration's handling of economic policies because we know that pandemic or not, these policies are not going to be pro-people. Maybe I can call on Nap from Migrante to talk a little bit more about maybe the migrant workers' comments.
Thank you, Adrian. As you heard his speech, I think for me, it's kind of deja vu, right? It's a lot of similar things, a lot of false promises that he said, and fake news that he said over his State of the Nation address, right? And a lot of fluff, a lot of words without meaning, and are even deceitful. He called migrants selfless, that they are healing and caring, but they are not just selfless out of their own choice. We are not just selfless out of our own choice, health workers everywhere, but because we were forced to into such condition, not just by the healthcare systems where our Filipino healthcare workers are distributed, but also very much because of Duterte's policies. So what is happening to healthcare workers, to migrants all over the world today who are stranded, Filipino migrant workers who are stranded, are a product of 4 decades of labor export policy that was started by none other than Duterte's idol, who is Ferdinand Marcos. And they are selfless. Because they've been forced to give up, themselves, because this government and all the governments before Duterte have taken away all the opportunities, from Filipino workers, Filipino peasants, Filipino professionals, that they've been forced to look for work abroad, without support, without aid from the government, as what we've seen today, where we have hundreds of thousands of migrants that have been stranded. Some have been even forced to look for food in dumpsters, right, in the Middle East, as we've seen in the news. Calling health workers selfless when just a few weeks ago, Duterte insinuated the health workers' demands in the Philippines, they were asking for help, asking for a break, but Duterte insinuated them and said that they were just asking for trouble, asking or threatening to wage a revolution against the government, right? There's also this promise of access to vaccine, which is just highly doubtful, given that even the first step, towards identifying the disease, mass testing, the Duterte government cannot even do, despite having borrowed what now at least $8.5 billion in loans from the Asian Development Bank and a lot of these other international financial institutions. Where did they go? We know that they've gone to the pockets of Duterte and his cronies. So there's that. And the repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. For people who don't know, Filipinos have been leaving the country at a rate of 6,500 Filipinos looking for work every day pre-COVID. And to the point that there are now at least 12 to 15 million Filipinos abroad. And now, almost half a million Filipinos have been repatriated back home. But then what? They will stay in the country without jobs. Right now there's massive unemployment, 17.7% at the very least, at a historic high. And that's because of the policies that Duterte and his predecessors have put in place that have really killed domestic industries, have deprived land to the tillers. And so now the Philippines is really in a really deep crisis. So just to close out, as we have been seeing in the past few months, Duterte will put up white dolomite sand in Manila Bay. He will put up false propaganda on Facebook and elsewhere. But he will do everything, and he has done everything except address the basic needs of the people, especially in this pandemic. The need for mass testing, for economic aid, for sustainable livelihood. So let us not be deceived. Calling on our kababayan, especially abroad, to not be deceived by this a new stunt, and keep fighting for truth, keep fighting for mass testing, for livelihood, for the rights of migrant workers and the masses in the Philippines. Salamat. And just next up, we have Nina Makapinlak from BAYAN, USA.
Thanks, Nap, and thank you everyone for putting this together so quickly. I know some people are watching on Facebook, so if people who are joining us would like to share their feedback, please do so via the Facebook comments. Yes, my name's Nina. I'm speaking on behalf of BAYAN USA. We're having Duterte address the United Nations a day after the martial law anniversary under the Philippine dictator Marcos. And now we have the dictator Duterte addressing the UN for the first time, spewing lies to defend his fascist regime. As my comrades have already said, Duterte has given shallow calls to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, all while failing the Filipino people so miserably during this pandemic. The Philippines is under one of the longest running and harshest lockdowns in the world. There are some figures that say that the killings have went up by 50%, but the COVID cases have not gone down. So it's obvious that Duterte cares more about using this pandemic to grab power than actually providing medical solutions to meeting the needs of the Filipino people. And what we're seeing here is a really dangerous conflation between fighting the pandemic and fighting terrorism. He alluded to terrorists weaponizing human rights, hiding behind schools, of activists weaponizing human rights, but really preying on the most vulnerable sections of the Philippine society. But who are the real terrorists in this situation? The real terrorist is the government, that Duterte's government, that is so keen on grabbing power and militarizing the country at the expense of oppressing its own people and killing activists and human rights defenders every week. We're seeing the expansion of Tokhang-style killings extended to anybody who seeks to speak out against him. In his speech, he seems to really be gathering support for the anti-terror law by fitting it into the UN strategy to combat global terrorism. But as the people, we must really ask, who is the real terrorist? And are these people that he is labeling and identifying as terrorists, which include some of us here, activists overseas? There's a concerted effort to target resistance of people internationally, because Duterte is so keen on justifying his atrocities by quelling resistance and pointing the finger at the people who are rightfully resisting him. Also, I just wanted to point out that he talks about full respect of principles of objectivity and non-interference, and that the Philippines upholds the UNCLO, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which alludes to something we've seen before of him invoking so-called Philippine independence and sovereignty as a way to justify his atrocities and defend the cold-blooded executions and murders of Filipino citizens. But we know that if Duterte actually cared about genuine sovereignty and independence, he wouldn't have, for example, pardoned Joseph Scott Pemberton, for a U.S. Marine who killed Jennifer Laude. He would not have backtracked on his promises to abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement. And so as we see these things, these allusions of him alluding to committing to the South China Sea in accordance with the UNCLOS, these calls for non-interference, etc., which is similar to what he's done before about calling for independent foreign policy and sovereignty. We know that this is not genuine sovereignty, and that the international community must continue to unite and to call for an independent investigation on the Philippines. So BAYAN USA calls on everybody overseas, all organizers, human rights loving people, to call for the stop to killing activists and human rights defenders in the Philippines, to end impunity in the Philippines, no more foreign military aid to Duterte the butcher, and to hold Duterte accountable for mass murder. And we must really continue to organize our communities, organize wherever there are Filipinos, unite with our allies around the world, and oust Duterte the dictator. Thank you.
Thank you.